vodka stale sweat and expensive sandalwood cologne. That was the first thing to hit Nora when she pushed open the heavy oak door of the study. Not a grand revelation, just a thick, humid odor that absolutely did not belong in a room usually smelling of polished leather and Dominic's imported cigars. She hadn't intended to check on him. Her hand was only on the brass knob because she'd found the ultrasound envelope in her coat pocket and wanted to leave it on his desk. A quiet, private surprise. 2 little beans on a grainy black and white printout. Instead, the door drifted open on silent, oiled hinges. Dominic's back was to her. The muscles of his shoulders flexed under his ruined, half-unbuttoned dress shirt. He had someone pinned against the edge of his mahogany desk. A woman. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess against the green leather blotter. Nora didn't need to see the woman's face. She knew that specific, breathless laugh. She knew the silver pendant dangling from the woman's neck because Nora had bought it for her 21st birthday. Lily. Her little sister. Nora didn't scream. She didn't drop the envelope. The movies always got that wrong, she realized in a dull, detached corner of her brain. Betrayal didn't come with a dramatic soundtrack or the shattering of glass. It came with a profound, sickening silence. Her stomach cramped a hard knot of pure nausea rising in her throat, tasting like the morning sickness she'd been fighting for 6 weeks. She watched Dominic's hands, the hands that had traced her spine hours ago, the hands that dismantled rival syndicates without a tremor grip her sister's hips. Nora's fingernails bit into her own palms until the skin broke. The pain was sharp grounding. It kept her legs from giving out. Slowly, carefully, she pulled the door shut. It clicked into the frame with a soft, dismissive snap. Neither of them heard it. They were too busy. Nora walked down the Persian runner of the hallway. Her feet felt like lead, yet she moved completely silently. She didn't go to their bedroom. She went straight to the hall closet, pulling down the worn canvas duffel bag she'd kept hidden behind winter coats since the day she realized Dominic's world of blood and money would eventually suffocate her. She just hadn't expected the suffocation to come from her own bloodline. 20 minutes. That was all it took to erase herself from Dominic Vane's life. She bypassed the jewelry, the designer dresses, the credit cards that tracked every swipe. She took the stacks of unmarked hundreds Dominic kept behind the vent in the guest bathroom for emergencies. She took her passport, 3 pairs of jeans, and the ultrasound photo. The drive out of the city was a blur of neon lights smearing across a rain-slicked windshield. The heater in her old sedan barely worked, blowing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust and exhaust. Nora gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, her jaw locked. She wouldn't cry. Crying was for victims, and she refused to be a casualty in Dominic's twisted game of loyalty. Months blurred into a miserable, grinding struggle for survival. She traded the sedan for cash and a rusted station wagon in a town that smelled like cow manure and diesel. She kept moving until she hit the edge of the country, a damp, forgotten fishing town on the Oregon coast, where the air was perpetually grey and tasted of dead crab and salt spray. The birth was brutal. No epidural, no hand to hold, just the sterile hum of a fluorescent light in an underfunded county hospital, and a nurse who smelled heavily of menthol cigarettes. When they finally laid the boys on her chest, Nora felt a terrifying, overwhelming weight. They were tiny, bruised, and screaming. Jack and Noah. 4 years later, the exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, becoming a permanent resident. Nora wiped down the Formica counter of the diner, ignoring the sticky residue of cheap maple syrup. The diner smelled intensely of burnt filter coffee and heavy bleach. Her lower back ached, a persistent throbbing that flared up every afternoon around 3 o'clock. Outside, the rain lashed against the fogged windows, blurring the passing headlights. Your boys are drawing on the booths again. Nora. Marv, the line cook, grunted through the pass, tossing a ticket onto the metal spindle. Nora threw her rag into the sink. I'll get them. Thanks, Marv. She walked to the back corner booth. Jack and Noah were huddled over a placemat, completely absorbed. They were 4, but they had the quiet intensity of much older men. Noah had her messy brown hair, but his jawline was already a harsh angle. Jack, however, was a ghost. Every time Nora looked at him, her chest seized. He had Dominic's exact ash-grey eyes, the kind of eyes that looked straight through you, analyzing weaknesses. "Hey, monsters," Nora said softly, sliding into the booth across from them. Her uniform, a hideous shade of mustard yellow, smelled like fry grease. Jack looked up, a blue crayon gripped tightly in his fist. Noah colored outside the lines. He reported flatly. "Did not," Noah muttered, shielding his paper. Nora reached out her rough, dishwater-chapped fingers, brushing Jack's cheek. The skin was warm, soft. Real. They were hers. Completely hers. No mafia bloodlines, no betrayals, no mansions built on extortion and violence. Just a leaky 2-bedroom apartment over a hardware store and a diet of bulk bin pasta. It wasn't a fairy tale. Most nights she woke up sweating, heart hammering against her ribs, convinced she'd heard the sound of a luxury sedan crunching on the gravel outside. Paranoia was a cold, creeping thing that lived at the base of her neck. But as she watched her sons bicker over a blue crayon, the smell of burnt coffee fading into the background, she felt a grim sense of victory. She had survived. She had vanished, or so she thought. Rainwater pooled in the deep asphalt craters of the discount grocery store parking lot. Nora's left boot had a hairline crack in the sole, and freezing water seeped in with every step, soaking her cheap cotton sock. She ignored the discomfort, leaning her weight into the rusted shopping cart. The front right wheel was locked, screeching in a high-pitched metallic whine across the wet pavement. "Mom, it's loud," Noah complained, pressing his hands over his ears. He was shivering in his oversized raincoat, the plastic yellow material stiff with the cold. "I know, baby. Almost to the car," Nora lied. Her station wagon was parked at the far end of the lot, under the flickering buzz of a dying sodium street lamp. She hoisted a plastic bag, the handles digging viciously into the calloused skin of her palms. Milk, generic brand, cereal peanut butter, and a bruised bag of apples. The meager spoils of a Tuesday evening. The damp air smelled of wet asphalt, rotting leaves from the nearby woods, and the distant metallic tang of the ocean. Jack was walking silently beside her, his small hand gripping the edge of her coat. He was always the observant one. While Noah complained about the noise, Jack's grey eyes scanned the empty parking lot. "Mom," Jack said. His voice didn't have a child's typical whine. It was flat, factual. "There's a black car." Nora's stomach dropped. Not a gentle descent, but a violent, plummeting plunge that emptied her lungs of air. She stopped pushing the cart. The screeching wheel went dead silent. The only sound was the rain hitting the plastic bags. It wasn't just a car, it was a matte black SUV, sitting perfectly still in the shadows near her station wagon. Its engine purred with a low, predatory hum, vibrating through the puddles. The headlights were off, but the faint glow of the street lamp reflected off the tinted windshield. It looked expensive, heavy, and completely out of place in a town where the most luxurious vehicle was a 10-year-old pickup truck. Panic raw and animalistic, tasted like copper in the back of her throat. "Run!" The instinct was blinding. Drop the groceries, grab the boys, and sprint for the woods. but her legs felt like they had been poured with concrete. Her cracked boots squelched as she took a half-step backward. The heavy armored door of the SUV clicked open. It didn't squeak. It moved with the heavy, silent precision of wealth. A heavy leather boot stepped onto the wet pavement. Then a long coat made of charcoal wool. Nora stopped breathing. He hadn't changed. 4 years hadn't added a single grey hair or a line of stress to his face. Dominic Vane stood under the sickly orange light, tall, imposing, and radiating a cold, terrifying stillness. The familiar, sickeningly sweet smell of his sandalwood cologne cut straight through the scent of rain and wet asphalt, hitting Nora like a physical blow to the chest. She pushed the boys behind her instinctively, her body forming a shield. Her hands trembling so violently, she dropped the bag of apples, instinctively went to the pockets of her worn coat, searching for keys she couldn't find. Dominic didn't move immediately. He stood by the open door of the SUV, letting the rain hit his face. His dark eyes locked onto her. There was no relief in his gaze, no joyous reunion, just a dark, consuming intensity that made Nora want to violently claw her way out of her own skin. He slowly closed the distance. Every step was deliberate. "You changed your hair," Dominic said. His voice was a low rumble, quieter than she remembered, but carrying the weight of an executioner's gavel. It lacked the smooth charm he used on his subordinates. It was raw, strained. Nora swallowed hard. Her throat was sandpaper. "Don't come any closer." Her voice cracked, betraying her terror. It sounded pathetic, weak. Dominic stopped a few feet away. His eyes flicked from her tired, unmake-upped face to the mustard-yellow diner uniform peeking out from under her cheap coat and finally down to her feet. 4 years. Dominic murmured the words, barely audible over the rain. 36 private investigators, millions of dollars. And you're in a damp corner of Oregon, wearing a broken shoe. "I have nothing to say to you, Dominic. Get back in your car." She tried to sound authoritative, but her hands were shaking so hard, the remaining grocery bags rattled loudly. "You didn't let me explain," he said, his jaw tightening. "You just vanished." There was nothing to explain. Nora snapped a sudden spike of venom, cutting through her fear. "I have eyes. I saw exactly what I needed to see. Now leave us alone." Dominic's gaze shifted. He looked past her. Nora shifted her weight, trying to block his view, but it was too late. Jack had peeked out from behind her legs. The silence that fell over the parking lot was absolute. Even the rain seemed to stop making a sound. Dominic stared at the 4-year-old boy. The color drained entirely from the Mafia Boss's face. The cold, impenetrable mask shattered, leaving behind a look of sheer, undisguised shock. He wasn't looking at Nora anymore. He was staring into a mirror. He was staring into his own ash-grey eyes. Then Noah peeked out from the other side, his brown hair plastered to his forehead, clutching his brother's sleeve. "Mom." Noah whispered, his voice trembling. "Who is that man?" Dominic physically swayed. A man who had taken bullets without flinching took a staggered step back, his hand reaching blindly for the hood of the rusty station wagon to steady himself. He looked at the twins, then back to Nora. His chest heaved, the wool of his coat rising and falling rapidly. "Twins!" Dominic choked out. The word tore from his throat, jagged and bloody. "You took my children. They are my children." Nora hissed, her protective instinct overriding the terror. She practically snarled the words, her posture aggressive, a cornered animal willing to bite. "You have no right to them. You gave up that right the second you put your hands on my sister." Dominic's eyes hardened, the shock rapidly bleeding into something much darker, much more dangerous. He stood up straight, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You don't get to make that decision," he said softly, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You don't get to steal my blood and hide them in the dirt." Nora realized with a sickening certainty that the nightmare hadn't ended 4 years ago when she drove away. It was only just beginning. Rainwater slid down the bridge of Nora's nose, pooling at the tip, before dropping onto the cracked pavement. It tasted faintly of salt and bitter exhaust fumes. She didn't wipe it away. Moving felt like a fatal error. Dominic didn't lunge. He didn't yell. That wasn't how he operated. Men who possessed absolute power rarely needed to raise their voices. Instead, he simply lifted his right hand, a subtle, almost lazy flick of his wrist. From the shadows behind the discount grocer, 2 more vehicles detached themselves from the darkness. They were identical matte black SUVs, their heavy tires hissing over the wet asphalt. They boxed in her rusted station wagon, blocking any conceivable exit route. 4 men stepped out into the downpour. They wore dark overcoats and moved with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of a wolf pack closing in on a wounded deer. They didn't draw weapons, they just stood there, forming an impenetrable wall of broad shoulders and blank expressions. Noah whimpered, burying his face into the wet fabric of Nora's cheap coat. His small fingers dug into her hip. Jack, however, stared directly at Dominic. The 4-year-old's jaw was set, mirroring the cold, analytical expression of the man standing 5 feet away. "Get in the car, Nora," Dominic said. His voice was a flat, vibrating baritone that cut perfectly through the sound of the rain. "No." The word scraped out of her throat. She gripped the boys tighter. "You can't do this! I'll scream! I'll scream until someone calls the police!" Dominic let out a harsh, humorless exhale. "Who are they going to call Nora, the local sheriff? The one who drives a leased truck he can't afford on a civil servant's salary? I can buy this entire zip code before you finish dialing 911. I can bulldoze that greasy diner you work in, and the hardware store you sleep above, and turn this whole miserable town into a parking lot." He stepped closer. The smell of his cologne sandalwood and sharp, expensive vetiver was suffocating. It triggered a violent, involuntary muscle memory in her core, a phantom touch on her spine. She hated her body for remembering him when her mind wanted him dead. "You are shivering," he noted, his eyes flicking to her trembling hands. "The boys are freezing. Get in the car. We are not doing this in a grocery store parking lot." "I am not going anywhere with you." "You are," Dominic countered, stepping fully into her personal space. The heat radiating off his body was a stark contrast to the freezing coastal wind. "Because if you force my men to put you in that vehicle, it will traumatize them." He nodded toward Jack and Noah. "And I would prefer my son's first memory of me not to be violence. Your choice." It wasn't a choice. It was a checkmate. Defeat tasted like bile. Nora's shoulders slumped, the rigid fight-or-flight tension snapping, leaving her feeling hollowed out and incredibly heavy. She couldn't fight 4 armed enforcers. She couldn't outrun his money. She turned awkwardly, shuffling her cracked boots toward the open door of the primary SUV. A man with a scarred jawline. Cole, she remembered his name, with a sickening jolt of familiarity, reached out to take her torn grocery bags. Nora flinched violently, pulling away from him. Cole's expression remained perfectly neutral as he stepped back, letting her keep the bags. Climbing into the vehicle felt like stepping into a vacuum-sealed vault. The heavy door thudded shut behind them instantly, cutting off the sound of the wind and rain. The interior smelled of pristine, factory-new leather and warm, dry air pumping from the climate control vents. It was a deeply expensive scent. Nora shoved the groceries onto the floorboard and pulled the boys onto the wide bench seat beside her. The leather was buttery soft, a cruel mockery of the abrasive, threadbare couch waiting for them in their apartment. Noah immediately curled into her side, his teeth chattering. Jack sat up straight, his hands resting on his knees, his grey eyes locked on the partition, separating the back from the driver's seat. The driver's door opened, letting in a brief rush of damp air before slamming shut. Dominic settled into the front passenger seat. He didn't look back at them. "Drive," he ordered softly. The SUV glided forward, moving with a heavy, terrifying smoothness. Nora stared out the tinted window. The discount grocery store, the flickering street lamp, the puddles, they all slipped away, swallowed by the darkness. Her chest felt incredibly tight, a band of iron squeezing her ribs until drawing a full breath became impossible. She looked down at her hands. They were raw, the knuckles split from hot dishwater and cheap bleach, the nails bitten down to the quick. She dragged her gaze to the back of Dominic's head. His dark hair was perfectly cut the collar of his wool coat, sitting immaculately against his neck. 4 years of running. 4 years of scrubbing grease off fryers, of rationing, peanut butter, of sleeping with a baseball bat under her bed. All of it erased in 20 minutes. He hadn't just found her. He had consumed her reality all over again. "Mum," Jack whispered. His voice was incredibly small, a rare crack in his stoic armor. Nora wrapped her arms around both of them, pulling them tightly against her chest, soaking her uniform with their wet raincoats. "I'm here," she breathed into Jack's hair. "I've got you." But as the SUV turned onto the coastal highway, heading away from town, Nora knew it was an empty promise. She didn't have them. Dominic Vane had them all. Heat blasted from the floor vents, thick and heavy, thawing the ice in Nora's veins, but replacing it with a creeping lethargy. The drive lasted barely 20 minutes, but in the oppressive silence of the SUV, it felt like an eternity. The vehicle turned off the main highway tires, crunching over a perfectly manicured gravel driveway. Nora pressed her face against the cold tinted glass. They were pulling up to a massive modern structure built directly into the jagged cliffside. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows glowed with warm, ambient light against the pitch-black backdrop of the Pacific Ocean. She knew this house. Locals gossiped about it, a tech billionaire's seasonal retreat that sat empty 11 months out of the year. Dominic hadn't just found her. He had prepared a cage. The SUV stopped under a wide concrete portico. The doors unlocked with a heavy electronic clunk. Cole opened her door before she could reach the handle. The damp ocean air hit her face, smelling of brine and wet pine needles. "Inside," Dominic instructed, stepping out of the front seat. He didn't wait for her to follow, striding toward the heavy oak front door that swung open as he approached. Nora gathered the boys. Noah was half asleep, his body limp and heavy as she hoisted him onto her hip. Jack slid out on his own, his small sneakers hitting the stone driveway. He grabbed the hem of her coat, sticking to her side like a shadow. The interior of the house was aggressively sterile. Heated, polished concrete floors, minimalist furniture with sharp angles, and an echoing silence that made Nora's wet boots sound incredibly loud. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom. Dominic stood in the center of the vast living area, shedding his wet overcoat. He draped it over the back of a white linen sofa, ruining the pristine fabric with rainwater. He didn't care. "Down the hall, second door on the left," Dominic said, not looking at her. He walked toward a massive marble kitchen island. "Put them to bed, then come back here." Nora wanted to scream at him to tell him she wasn't his employee, but Noah's head was heavy against her shoulder, his breathing ragged with exhaustion. She swallowed her pride a bitter, jagged pill, and walked down the hallway. The bedroom was massive, dominated by a king-sized bed covered in dark, heavy duvets. She stripped the boys out of their wet raincoats and damp shoes. Noah didn't even wake up as she tucked him under the covers. Jack stayed awake longer, his grey eyes watching her every move. "Is the man going to hurt us?" Jack asked, his voice a tiny, raspy whisper. Nora paused, her hand resting on his forehead. "No," she said, and surprisingly she knew it was the truth. "He won't hurt you. Me, she thought, is a different story. Go to sleep, Jack." She waited until his breathing evened out, plunging into the deep sleep of an exhausted child. She stood by the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the muffled roar of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. She was stalling, delaying the inevitable. Finally, she walked back down the hallway. Dominic was sitting on one of the leather bar stools at the kitchen island. He had a heavy crystal tumbler in his hand, a splash of amber liquid swirling at the bottom. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. The smell of bourbon mixed with his cologne, creating a heavy, intoxicating scent in the warm air. He didn't speak as she approached. He just watched her. Nora stopped on the opposite side of the marble island. The physical distance felt necessary. "What do you want, Dominic?" Her voice sounded raspy, worn thin. "I want my sons," he said simply. He took a slow sip of the bourbon. "And I want to know why you stole 4 years of their lives from me." Anger, hot and sudden, flared in her chest, burning away the exhaustion. "I saved them from you, from your life, from getting blown up in a car or shot in a restaurant." "Don't hide behind them." Dominic snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He set the glass down on the marble with a sharp, resonant clink. "You didn't leave because of the business. You knew exactly who I was the day you married me. You left because of Lily." Hearing her sister's name in his mouth made Nora's stomach twist violently. "Do not say her name." "You walked into my study." Dominic continued ignoring her, his eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "You saw her on my desk, and instead of acting like a wife, instead of confronting me, you packed a bag and vanished." "Confront you?" Nora laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped her throat. What was there to confront, Dominic? Was I supposed to ask politely why my husband had his hands under my little sister's skirt? "You should have asked why she was bleeding," Dominic said. The words hit the air like physical blows. Nora froze. Her hands resting on the cold marble went entirely numb. The ambient hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening. "What?" The word barely made it past her lips. Dominic stared at her, his expression a terrifying mix of fury and profound exhaustion. She wasn't wearing a skirt, Nora. She was wearing jeans, and she was bleeding through them. She showed up at my office because she owed $20,000 to the Romanos for a pill habit you pretended not to notice. They cornered her in an alley, sliced her side open to make a point. He picked up the glass again, his knuckles white. "I was trying to stop the bleeding while waiting for the private doctor to arrive. I had her pinned against the desk so she wouldn't thrash around and make the laceration worse." Nora's mind completely blanked. The room tilted, the sharp angles of the furniture blurring together. She remembered the twisted blonde hair, the breathless laugh. No, it wasn't a laugh. It was a sob, a gasp of pain. She remembered the wetness on the green leather blotter. She had assumed it was sweat or spilled liquor. "You're lying," she whispered, shaking her head. But the denial was weak, fragile. "I don't lie," Dominic said coldly. "I kill, I extort, and I ruin lives. But I do not lie to you, and I certainly do not sleep with my wife's junkie sister." He stood up, towering over the island. The shadow he cast seemed to swallow her whole. You didn't ask. You just assumed the worst of me. And for that, you stole my blood. He leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the marble. You can hate me, Nora, but you will never keep them from me again. Nausea didn't just hit her. It crawled up her throat like crushed glass. Nora gripped the edge of the marble island, her knuckles turning bone white. The kitchen suddenly felt too hot, the ambient hum of the stainless steel refrigerator vibrating directly into her teeth. She wanted to call him a liar. It would be easier. If Dominic was lying the last 4 years of grinding poverty, the aching back, the perpetual fear it was all justified. A righteous sacrifice to protect her children from a monster. But Dominic Vane didn't lie. He manipulated, he withheld, and he omitted, but a direct, verifiable lie was beneath him. It was a matter of professional pride. If he said Lily was bleeding, she was bleeding. Where is she? Nora's voice sounded hollow, stripped of all its previous venom. She couldn't look at his face. She stared at the thick bottom of his crystal tumbler, watching a single square ice cube slowly melt into the amber bourbon. Rehab. Again, Dominic stated flatly. He took a slow drink, the ice clinking against the glass. A private facility in Switzerland, far away from the Romanos, far away from the dealers in the city. I pay the invoices every quarter. She asks about you every time I check in. Nora closed her eyes. The darkness behind her eyelids wasn't peaceful. It was a chaotic swirl of memories. Lily's erratic behavior those last few months, the sudden weight loss, the missing cash from Nora's purse that she had blamed on her own forgetfulness. She had ignored the symptoms because it was easier than confronting the ugly reality of addiction. She had seen what she wanted to see in that study because she was already desperate for a reason to run. I didn't know, Nora whispered. The admission tasted like ash. You didn't want to know, Dominic corrected softly. There was no triumph in his voice, just a heavy, grating weariness. You were already looking for the exit, Nora. The business disgusted you. The security detail suffocated you. Lily was just the convenient excuse you needed to finally pull the ripcord. He walked around the island. Nora flinched, an involuntary muscle spasm, but she didn't step back. Dominic stopped a foot away, close enough that the heat radiating from his chest combated the chill still lingering in her damp clothes, close enough that she could see the faint, silvery scar cutting through the dark stubble on his jawline, a souvenir from a territory dispute in his 20s. You're right, Nora said, forcing her head up to meet his gaze. Her eyes burned dry and hot, but she refused to cry. I was suffocating. Every time you left the house, I wondered if you were coming back in a car or a body bag. I hated the money. I hated the men who worked for you. But even if I was wrong about Lily, I wasn't wrong about the danger. She was sliced open in an alley because of your world, Dominic. Because the Romanos knew she was connected to you. She owed them money, Nora. They are loan sharks. It is business. It's blood. Nora snapped, slamming her palm against the marble. The stinging pain grounded her. It's violence. It's a sickness that infects everything around it. I drove away to protect myself. But the second those boys were born, I stayed away to protect them. I will not let them grow up learning how to calculate the blast radius of a car bomb. Dominic's jaw clenched. The muscles ticked under his skin. He reached out his hand, hovering in the space between them. For a fraction of a second, Nora thought he was going to wrap his fingers around her throat. Instead, he gently caught a damp strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers were warm, calloused, and terrifyingly gentle. You think poverty is safe? He murmured, his thumb brushing the rough, chapped skin of her jaw. You think living above a hardware store with a broken lock keeps them out of harm's way. What happens when a meth head breaks in looking for copper wire? What happens when one of them gets sick and you can't afford a specialist? Your protection is an illusion. Nora. It's a fairy tale. He dropped his hand, stepping back instantly, severing the electric tension that had spiked between them. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely hollow. They are my sons. Dominic said, his tone shifting back to the cold, authoritative register of a man who commanded an empire. They will be educated. They will be protected by men who know how to do it properly. They will never wear broken shoes, and they will never sleep in a damp room again. You can't just buy them. She countered, her voice trembling slightly. They don't know you. You are a stranger in a black coat who terrified them in a parking lot. Then I suggest you help me fix that, Dominic replied, picking up his glass and draining the last of the bourbon. He set it down with a definitive click. Because we are leaving for New York tomorrow. You can either sit in the back seat and explain to them who I am, or you can stay here in Oregon. But Jack and Noah are coming with me. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the kitchen, his leather shoes silent against the polished concrete, leaving Nora alone in the vast, sterile room with nothing but the sound of the ocean breaking violently against the cliffs outside. Sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows, sharp and blindingly white. It was a violent contrast to the grey gloom that usually suffocated the Oregon coast. Nora woke with a gasp, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The mattress beneath her was impossibly soft, the sheets smelling of crisp linen and mild, expensive detergent. For a disorienting 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then the events of the previous night crashed down on her in a suffocating wave. The parking lot, the SUV, the revelation about Lily. She threw off the heavy duvet. The space beside her in the massive bed was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Jack Noah. She scrambled off the mattress, ignoring the dull ache in her lower back. She hadn't bothered to change out of her uniform last night, merely shedding her damp coat and boots before collapsing beside her sleeping children. The mustard-yellow fabric was deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of old diner grease. She ran down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the heated concrete floor. The silence of the house was oppressive. It didn't sound like a house with 2 4-year-old boys in it. There was no bickering, no thudding footsteps. Nora rounded the corner into the expansive kitchen and froze. Dominic was standing at the industrial gas stove. He had stripped off the suit jacket and tie, wearing a dark-fitted crewneck sweater that clung to the broad span of his shoulders. He was meticulously flipping thick strips of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The kitchen smelled intensely of smoked meat, rendering fat and rich dark roast coffee. Sitting at the marble island perched on 2 heavy leather bar stools were Jack and Noah. They weren't speaking. Noah was practically hiding behind his own shoulders, his brown eyes wide and fearful, his hands gripped tightly in his lap. He kept darting anxious glances toward the door, relaxing fractionally when he finally spotted Nora. Jack, however, was a completely different story. He sat perfectly upright, his small hands resting flat on the cool marble. His ash-grey eyes were locked onto Dominic's back, analyzing every movement the man made with a quiet, unnerving intensity. "Mom!" Noah whimpered, slipping off the tall stool. His bare feet hit the floor, and he ran to her, burying his face in her thighs. Nora immediately dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head, her eyes flicking to Dominic. Dominic didn't turn around. He calmly transferred the bacon to a plate lined with a stark white paper towel. "They woke up 20 minutes ago," he said, his voice level. "I told them you were sleeping." "You shouldn't have been alone with them," Nora snapped, standing up and pulling Noah behind her leg. It was an instinctual defensive posture. Dominic finally turned. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there last night. "I was making breakfast. I haven't poisoned them, Nora." He picked up 2 porcelain plates and walked around the island, setting one in front of Jack's empty seat and sliding the other toward Nora. Eggs perfectly scrambled and 3 strips of bacon. Simple. Efficient. Jack hadn't moved. He looked at the plate, then up at Dominic. "Why are your eyes like mine?" the boy asked. The bluntness of the question seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Nora stopped breathing. She reached out, intending to pull Jack away to shield him from whatever cold, calculated response Dominic was about to deliver. But Dominic didn't brush the question off. He pulled out the stool next to Jack and sat down. For the first time, Nora saw the imposing Mafia Boss look momentarily unsure. He didn't slouch, but the rigid, aggressive posture he usually carried himself with softened slightly. "Because I am your father," Dominic said. He didn't use a baby voice. He spoke to the 4-year-old with the same flat, factual tone he used in boardrooms. Jack didn't gasp. He didn't look confused. He simply digested the information, his brow furrowing slightly. "Mum said my father was lost." Dominic's gaze flicked to Nora. A dark, quiet anger simmered in his eyes, but he quickly redirected his attention back to the boy. "Your mother and I had a disagreement. She decided to go away for a while. I have spent a very long time looking for you. I was not lost. I just couldn't find you." "Are you going to yell at her?" Jack asked, his voice steady. "The man who lived downstairs yelled. He threw a bottle. It broke on our door." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with implications. Nora felt her face burn with shame. She had tried to hide that incident from them, packing them into the bathroom until the drunk neighbor had passed out in the hallway. Dominic's hands resting on his thighs slowly curled into fists. The knuckles turned stark white. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "No," Dominic said, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "I am never going to yell at her, and no one will ever throw anything at your door again. I promise you that." Noah tugged on Nora's pants, peeking out from behind her legs. "Is he taking us away?" "We are going to my home," Dominic answered before Nora could. "It is a very big house in New York. You will have your own rooms. You will have a yard that isn't a parking lot." Nora watched the exchange, a profound sense of helplessness washing over her. She couldn't fight this. Dominic wasn't dragging them away, kicking and screaming. He was systematically dismantling the fragile, broken life she had built for them and offering a bulletproof alternative. Jack picked up a piece of bacon. He took a small bite, chewed methodically, and swallowed. He looked at Dominic, then at the plate, and finally at Nora. "The bacon is better than Marv's," Jack stated. Nora closed her eyes. It was a simple, childish observation, but it felt like the final nail in the coffin. The war was over. Dominic had won. Packing took exactly 12 minutes. Nora stood in the center of the cramped living room, above the hardware store, holding a single frayed canvas duffel bag. The apartment smelled heavily of stale radiator heat, cheap pine cleaner, and the faint, permanent undertone of mildew creeping up the bathroom drywall. Dominic stood by the door. He looked entirely too large for the space, his dark wool coat brushing the peeling floral wallpaper of the entryway. He hadn't said a word since they climbed the narrow, sagging wooden stairs, but his silence was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Nora's chest. He was cataloguing everything. The threadbare sofa with the sunken cushions, the rusted hot plate sitting on a slanted formica counter, the singular rattling window unit that barely kept out the bitter Oregon chill. "Is this all?" Dominic asked, his voice deliberately flat. His eyes flicked to the frayed duffel bag in her hand. "We travel light," Nora replied. Her voice sounded defensive thin. She hated the hot flush of shame crawling up her neck. She had kept her boys alive here. She had fed them, bathed them, and read them library books on that sunken sofa. It was a life built on pure survival, but under his analytical gaze, it just looked like squalor. Dominic stepped fully into the room. He walked past her, his heavy leather shoes clicking against the warped linoleum. He pushed open the flimsy door to the bedroom. It squeaked loudly on unoiled hinges, a grating sound that made Nora wince. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the single full-sized mattress pushed into the corner, the thin, mismatched blankets neatly folded. Then his gaze dropped to the floor. Nora's stomach plummeted. He was looking at the wooden baseball bat tucked partially under the metal bed frame. Dominic slowly reached down and pulled it out. The wood was splintered at the handle, the grip wrapped poorly in cheap black electrical tape. He held it in his large hand, testing the weight. The muscles in his jaw worked tight and rigid, rippling under the skin. "Who was it for?" he asked softly, not looking at her. "Anyone." Nora answered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. The mustard-yellow diner uniform was gone, replaced by a pair of faded jeans and a grey sweater that was beginning to pill heavily at the elbows. Drunk neighbours, addicts looking for a quick score in the hardware store below. "You." Dominic turned his head. His ash-grey eyes met hers. There was no explosive anger in them, only a dark, bottomless well of something that looked dangerously like regret. He set the bat down gently on the bare mattress. "You will never need to swing a piece of wood in the dark again," he stated. It wasn't a comfort. It was a vow sealed with the chilling certainty of a man who dealt exclusively in permanent solutions. He walked out of the bedroom, bypassing her entirely. "Cole has the boys in the car. Let's go." The drive to the private airfield was a blur of driving rain and towering skeletal pine trees. Nora sat in the back of the SUV between Jack and Noah. The boys were unusually quiet. The sudden influx of strangers, heavy armored vehicles, and their mother's rigid tension had finally overwhelmed their small nervous systems. Noah sucked his thumb, a habit he had supposedly broken a year ago, while Jack stared blankly at the tinted window, watching the miserable town disappear into the fog. The jet sat on the wet tarmac, sleek white and completely out of place against the dreary coastal backdrop. The smell of combusted jet fuel and wet asphalt was pungent to burning Nora's nostrils as they crossed the runway under large black umbrellas held by silent men. Stepping into the cabin was like stepping into an alternate dimension. The air was perfectly temperature-controlled, smelling richly of polished mahogany, fresh linen, and expensive catering. Wide cream leather seats, polished brass fixtures, and a quiet ambient hum masked the roar of the engines spinning up. Nora buckled Noah into a wide seat. He was asleep before the plane even began to taxi, his small body utterly exhausted by the emotional whiplash. Jack sat across the aisle, his legs dangling over the edge of the thick cushion, watching Cole secure the heavy cabin doors with analytical precision. Dominic took the seat directly across from Nora. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulling a thin tablet from a leather briefcase. He didn't offer small talk. He didn't try to coddle her nerves. The plane surged forward, the sheer violent power pressing Nora deep into the upholstery. She watched the Oregon coastline fall away beneath them, the grey churning ocean swallowed by heavy clouds. The physical distance between her and her poverty was increasing by the second, but the cold knot in her stomach only tightened. She looked across the table at Dominic. He was scrolling through emails, his sharp profile illuminated by the cool blue light of the screen. "I'm sorry," Nora said. The words slipped out before she could lock them behind her teeth. They felt like broken glass tearing up her throat. Dominic's finger stopped on the glass screen. He didn't look up immediately. "About Lily?" Nora clarified her voice, dropping to a harsh whisper so she wouldn't wake Noah. "I should have asked. I shouldn't have assumed the worst." Dominic slowly locked the tablet and set it face down on the polished table. He finally looked at her. His expression remained carefully blank, a mask carved from cold stone. "Apologies don't change the past, Nora. They don't give me back the first 4 years of my son's lives." He leaned back in his seat, the leather creaking softly under his shifting weight. "You made a calculation. You thought I was a monster who would defile your bleeding sister in my own home. You acted accordingly." "I was scared." She admitted the raw, ugly truth bleeding out of her. "You should have been scared of the Romanos," Dominic corrected smoothly, his voice devoid of pity. "You should have been scared of the world outside my protection. Instead, you decided I was the threat." He looked away, turning his gaze toward the small oval window. "We land in 5 hours. Get some sleep. You look like a ghost." The conversation was over. He had drawn the boundary line in the sand. He wasn't going to punish her physically, but he wasn't going to grant her absolution either. They were bound by blood and betrayal, locked in a metal tube, rocketing toward a city she had sworn never to return to. Nora closed her eyes, the faint vibration of the jet engines seeping deep into her bones. And for the first time in 4 years, she didn't know what to fear more, the violent enemies waiting in New York, or the cold, indifferent stranger sitting across from her. Tires kissing the tarmac with a sharp, burning screech jolted Nora awake. The cabin was dim. The ambient lighting shifted to a cool, clinical blue. Outside the thick porthole window, the sprawling, chaotic grid of New York City glittered against the pitch-black night sky like scattered diamonds. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. It was the Empire. Noah stirred beside her, letting out a confused, sleepy whine. Nora unbuckled her belt, reaching over to rhythmically rub his back. Her muscles were impossibly stiff, a dull ache throbbing relentlessly at the base of her skull. Dominic was already standing, slipping his muscular arms into his heavy charcoal overcoat. He moved with a crisp, predatory energy, entirely unbothered by the 5-hour flight. "Cole has the bags," he said, not waiting for her to fully orient herself to the time zone change. "The cars are idling." Stepping off the plane, the New York air hit her lungs entirely differently than the coastal wind. It was sharper, biting tasting of heavy exhaust cold concrete and an electric vibrating tension. 3 matte black SUVs idled on the private tarmac, their massive engines humming in perfect synchronized purrs, cutting through the frigid night air. The drive to the compound was a silent, suffocating affair. The boys were wide awake now, their faces pressed flat against the cold-tinted glass, mesmerized by the towering skyscrapers and the rapid blur of neon lights. Jack didn't ask a single question. He simply absorbed the data, his grey eyes cataloguing the route, the heavy urban traffic, the sudden jarring shift from the concrete jungle to the sprawling manicured estates of the city's elite outskirts. Heavy wrought-iron gates parted soundlessly as the lead SUV approached. The Vane estate sat at the absolute end of a long, winding driveway, lined with ancient skeletal oak trees. The house itself was a sprawling limestone manor, its sheer size imposing, heavy and cold. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress disguised as old generational wealth. Nora remembered the smell of the foyer perfectly. As the heavy double doors swung inward, the scent washed over her, triggering a violent wave of nausea, beeswax, polish hothouse lilies, and the faint underlying metallic tang of extreme security and absolute power. The black and white marble floor gleamed blindingly under the massive crystal chandelier reflecting the harsh artificial light. A woman stood near the base of the sweeping curved staircase. Maria, the head housekeeper. Her dark hair was heavily streaked with silver, now pulled back into a severe, immovable bun. When she saw Nora, the older woman's professional neutrality slipped for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes widening slightly before instantly snapping back to a composed, deadpan stare. "Welcome home, Mr. Vane," Maria said, her voice heavily accented and perfectly steady. Her gaze shifted downward to the two small boys clinging tightly to Nora's denim-clad legs. "And the young masters. Have the West Wing nursery prepared immediately," Dominic instructed casually, handing his heavy coat to a waiting, silent shadow of a man. "They will sleep there tonight. Have food brought up. Simple things. Grilled chicken rice, nothing heavy on the stomach." "Right away, sir." "Dominic." Nora interrupted her voice, echoing slightly in the cavernous stone space. The sheer scale of the house was architecturally designed to make people feel small, to force them to whisper. She forced herself to speak at a normal conversational volume. "They aren't sleeping in a nursery across the house. They don't know this place. They don't know these people." Dominic paused with one foot on the bottom stair, turning slowly to face her. His expression was impassive, a blank, terrifying slate that gave away absolutely nothing. "They are Vanes. They will not sleep in a bed with their mother, like frightened stray animals. They have their own rooms. They have armed security detailed to their door. They are perfectly safe." "They are 4 years old." Nora fired back, the raw, gritty exhaustion finally chipping away at her polite restraint. "They just spent 5 hours on a plane, and yesterday they lived above a rusted hardware store. I am not leaving them alone in a wing of a house they've never seen." The air in the grand foyer crystallized. Maria and the other staff members seemingly melted into the heavy oak paneling, practically vanishing to avoid witnessing the boss being directly challenged. Jack stepped out from behind Nora's leg. He looked up at the massive glittering chandelier, then down at his own worn sneakers on the polished marble, and finally at Dominic. "I want to stay with my mum," Jack stated. His voice didn't shake. It wasn't a plea, it was a factual demand. Dominic stared down at his son. A muscle ticked furiously beneath the skin of his jaw. For a long, suffocating moment, nobody breathed. The standoff was silent, heavy, and incredibly dangerous. Then Dominic let out a slow, deeply controlled exhale. The rigid tension in his broad shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He looked from Jack to Nora, his eyes cold, dark, and calculating. "Fine." Dominic conceded the single word, clipped and sharp. "They sleep in the master suite tonight. Maria have a rollaway cot brought to the main bedroom." He didn't wait for a grateful response. He turned and walked down the long shadowed hallway, leading to his private study, the heavy oak doors closing behind him, with a resonant, booming thud that echoed through the unnervingly quiet house. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding her knees, trembling slightly under the faded denim. She had won a minor, pathetic skirmish, but the victory tasted exactly like ash. Maria stepped forward, her expression marginally softer now, though still heavily guarded. "Follow me, Mrs. Vane. I will show you to your rooms." "It's just Nora Maria," she said softly, gathering Noah into her arms. The boy was too heavy for her tired, aching back, but she desperately needed the physical anchor of his warm weight. Maria gave a small, sad, knowing smile, leading the way up the sweeping staircase. "In this house, Ma'am, you are exactly who he says you are. And tonight, you are Mrs. Vane." The master suite was exactly as she had left it 4 years ago. Deep burgundy accents, heavy velvet blackout curtains, and the faint, lingering scent of his sandalwood cologne permanently embedded in the fibers of the expensive Persian rug. The massive king-sized bed dominated the room, an island of dark silk and thick down pillows. A maid quietly wheeled in a small cot, setting it up near the far wall, before quickly exiting without making eye contact. Nora mechanically went through the motions, helping the boys brush their teeth in the opulent marble bathroom, changing them into oversized t-shirts scavenged from Dominic's dresser, because their own clothes suddenly felt entirely too dirty for the pristine space. She tucked them into the massive bed, the two small bodies looking utterly swallowed by the expensive heavy linens. Noah fell asleep almost instantly, his small fist clutching a silk pillowcase. Jack stayed awake longer, his grey eyes tracing the intricate, hand-carved crown moulding on the high ceiling. "It's too big," Jack whispered into the darkness of the room. Nora sat on the edge of the mattress, running her fingers through his dark hair, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse beneath her thumb. "I know, baby. I know. Are we trapped here?" The question pierced straight through her chest, a jagged, agonizing truth ripping through the dark. She looked down at her son, seeing Dominic's analytical, hyper-aware eyes staring back at her in the dim light. She couldn't lie to him. Not about this. "Yes," Nora whispered softly, the word scraping her throat, tasting like absolute defeat. "Yes, we are." Silence in the master suite was a physical weight pressing down on Nora's chest until her lungs burned. Jack and Noah were finally asleep, their breathing synchronized in the massive bed. Nora lay on top of the covers, staring at the shadowed ceiling. The silk sheets beneath her chapped hands felt unnaturally smooth, almost repellent. Her body, conditioned by 4 years of sagging springs and rough cotton, violently rejected the luxury. She needed a drink of water. Not from the pristine crystal carafe resting on the silver tray on the nightstand, but cold, biting tap water to shock her system into clarity. Slipping off the edge of the mattress, she moved silently on bare feet into the adjoining master bath. The cold marble floor sent a sharp ache up her calves. She turned the heavy brass faucet, cupping her hands and splashing the freezing water against her face. The smell of expensive milled soap clung to the air, suffocating in its richness. Leaving the bathroom, she bypassed the bed entirely. The hallway outside was dimly lit by wrought-iron sconces, casting long, distorted shadows against the imported limestone walls. At the far end of the corridor, near the top of the sweeping stairs, a man in a dark suit stood perfectly still. He didn't acknowledge her presence with a word, but his eyes tracked her every movement. It wasn't protection. It was observation. A silent reminder of her new reality. Nora walked in the opposite direction. She didn't consciously choose the destination, but deep-seated muscle memory guided her down the curving staircase and toward the west wing. The ambient temperature dropped slightly here, the air growing heavier. The heavy oak door to the study was slightly ajar. A single desk lamp cut a sharp yellow triangle of light through the absolute darkness inside. Nora paused at the threshold. This was the room, the exact spot where her old life had shattered. She expected the phantom scent of copper blood or Lily's cheap floral perfume to hit her a psychological trap. Instead, the air was thick with the smell of old paper leather polish and Dominic's persistent sandalwood cologne. Dominic was sitting behind the mahogany desk. He had discarded his dark sweater, wearing only a white undershirt that clung to his chest, the faint outline of old, jagged knife scars visible over his ribs. He wasn't working. He was staring at something small and rectangular, resting flat on the green leather blotter. Nora pushed the door open the rest of the way. The oiled hinges were completely silent, just as they had been 4 years ago. Dominic didn't look up, but his voice broke the quiet low and entirely stripped of its usual, impenetrable armor. I found this on the edge of the desk after the paramedics took Lily away. Nora walked closer, her bare feet sinking into the thick, plush fibers of the Persian rug. She stopped at the very edge of the lamplight. Resting on the desk right where he had pinned her sister to stop the bleeding was the grainy black and white ultrasound printout. The edges were heavily worn, the glossy paper creased, cracked, and softened by countless thumbprints. He had kept it. He had stared at it for 4 years. I thought it was a sick joke at first. Dominic continued his voice, barely a rasp, scraping against the silence of the room. He slowly traced the edge of the photo with his index finger. A parting shot to twist the knife. Then I realized you wouldn't use your own child as a weapon. You just dropped it in your panic. I had it in my coat pocket to surprise you, Nora said. Her voice felt terribly thin, vibrating in her throat. I was going to put it in a blank envelope on your chair. Dominic finally raised his head. The exhaustion in his grey eyes was absolute, hollowing out his face and making him look terrifyingly human, stripping away the myth of the untouchable boss. Every single day, Nora, I looked at this piece of paper every single day, knowing my blood was out there, growing, walking, speaking, and I didn't even know their names. The raw agony in his confession paralyzed her. This was the contradiction that tore her apart. He was a ruthless architect of violence, a man who ordered executions without a second thought. Yet looking at the worn, faded edges of the ultrasound, she saw a father who had been entirely hollowed out by grief. Their names are Jack and Noah. She whispered, the fight completely drained from her weary bones. Dominic stood up. He moved slowly, bypassing the heavy desk and closing the small distance between them. Nora didn't flinch. She let him step into her space. The heat radiating off his skin was a sharp contrast to the chill of the stone house. He reached out his large hands, gently cupping her face, his thumbs rough and calloused from years of holding cold steel and pulling triggers brushed over her cheekbones. I know why you ran, he murmured, his breath warm against her forehead. I understand the terror, but you have to understand this. I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone hurt you or those boys again. I will turn every street into ash. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Dominic. Nora breathed, closing her eyes against the dark intensity of his gaze. Your love is a war zone. It is the only kind of love I have to give, he replied brutally, unapologetically. But it is completely yours. He kissed her forehead, a heavy, permanent brand against her skin. It wasn't a soft apology, and it certainly wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was a violent claim. Nora stood in the dimly lit study, surrounded by the smell of leather and a dangerous man's cologne. She thought of her cracked boots sitting in the mudroom, the terrifying vulnerability of the rusty station wagon, and the bitter cold of the Oregon rain. Then she thought of Jack sleeping under heavy silk guarded by men with guns. She opened her eyes and looked up at Dominic. The cage doors had slammed shut, locking her inside with the monster. But as his rough thumb wiped a single traitorous tear from her cheek, Nora realized the most terrifying truth of all. She was trading the fear of poverty for the fear of the bullet, and God help her she didn't want to leave.